Hi, I'm Max Kaiser. Welcome to On the Edge. Let's not waste any time and go right to New York and speak with Dimitri Kofinas. He's an economics blogger and a financial radio host and producer of Covering the Spread, which airs on 91.5 FM WNYE in New York. Dimitri, welcome to On the Edge.
Thanks, Max. Thanks for having me on.
You were in Athens reporting from Syntagma Square or Constitution Square. We all saw the images of conflict, what was actually passed in the Greek parliament that caused all the riots.
Well, what you had, there were two votes. One was on Wednesday, one was on Thursday. Wednesday was the more important vote. That was to pass a 28 billion euro 5-year austerity package that included tax hikes and privatization measures that the Greek government needed to pass in order to get the next installment of a 12 billion euro tranche payment that was part of the 110 billion euro bailout that the government got about a year ago. Tax measures included things like VAT increases, tax increases on cars, homes, things like that. And as far as privatization measures are concerned, we've already sold the balance of our public telephone company, but most of the public utilities and other public assets have not yet been sold. And one of the reasons for that is that there's a lot of pressure against these measures by a lot of the entrenched unions and things like that. We had, while I was in Greece, we had a lot of rolling blackouts, for example, from the public utility company, the public power company. So that's what those protests and things were about regarding the vote. And because of the nature of these payments, the fact that they're given out in tranches, and that each tranche is used as an opportunity to squeeze the government a little bit more, to get it to pass more austerity measures so that it can begin to run a primary budget surplus, and so that it can continue to liquidate a lot of these national wealth assets and corporations, things like that. Because of that, I think you're just going to continue to see this go on and on. We have another big vote coming in September, so we're nowhere near out of the woods yet.
Okay, so review for us exactly who is the Troika.
Well, the Troika is the IMF, the EC, and the ECB. It's the three sort of bureaucratic bodies that are working together to find, quote, solution to the peripheral debt crisis in Europe. And of course, behind the Troika is the banking system, both the European and the American banking system. And as you've rightly pointed out before, Max, it's also the American banking system that's exposed, not just through outright ownership of peripheral debt, but also having issued CDS contracts against that debt. So that's who the Troika is on the one hand. On the other hand, members of the Troika are working together to try to use this crisis to consolidate further the European periphery and to integrate Europe into this larger fiscal body that has long been envisioned by bureaucrats, which would create effectively a European treasury and a Eurobond market. And the Eurobond market's a very important thing. It's somewhat overlooked by people because, remember, in 1913, with the creation of the Federal Reserve, one of the prime principles, one of the prime motivating factors that was pushed by Paul Warburg and other founders was the expansion of the bankers' acceptances market and the role that would play for the Federal Reserve as it attempted to manipulate interest rates, because it's not just having a central bank that's important, it's also having a large pool of liquidity within which the ECB can play like a giant white shark and move around and manipulate the price of money. So that's who the Troika is. It's the banks on the one hand trying to work to find a solution to save their balance sheets, and on the other, it's an attempt to really work together to put together this dream that bureaucrats and European Union members have had for a very long time.
All right, you mentioned securitization and privatization of assets. I was struck in particular with the numbers that are being tossed around relating to the state lottery system, which I believe does something like $900 million a year or euros a year in revenue. And the talk around the privatization table is to sell it off for $450 million. So how do they justify that kind of price tag, half of the revenues as a legitimate price? Because the reason I ask this is because at the same time, in New York, on Wall Street, you've got Wall Street banks like Goldman Sachs and others who are taking companies public, for example, Groupon, who are losing $450 to $500 million, and yet they think they're worth $20 or $30 billion. And yet the same banks will look at an established business like Greece's lottery business doing $900 million in business, and they say it's not even worth half that in a sale. How do they justify that?
Well, of course, there's no justification for it. The only justification is that Greece is on its knees, it's vulnerable, and it's a great opportunity for these creditors to liquidate as much of the country's wealth and national assets as possible. And at the same time, just as we saw in the United States, remember with TARP, these banks had a lot of these illiquid assets that they couldn't get off their books, so they set up this bailout mechanism, this TARP mechanism, to get 100 cents on the dollar for all their illiquid garbage, while at the same time not resisting getting money from the CDS contracts that they had from AIG and other conduits. So the analogous situation in Europe, of course, is the EFSF, the European Financial Stability Facility, and the ESM, where these banks can avoid getting a haircut, can continue to get interest payments in from these bailouts from German and French taxpayers, while at the same time using Greece's insolvency and dire economic situation as an excuse to liquidate more of the nation's wealth, liquidate more of the nation's assets, and of course use the crisis as an opportunity to integrate the periphery of Europe, countries like Greece and Portugal and Spain and Ireland, but also perhaps the center as well at some point in the future into this Eurocratic dream, which is a fiscally consolidated European banking system, treasury, and Euro bond market. I think that's the justification, that's the goal, and that's what you're saying.
Right, Dimitri Kofinas, George Papandreou, the Prime Minister, said a few weeks ago that his country is being run by the rating agencies, meaning Moody's, S&P, and Fitch. And just today there's been some more controversy in that the rating agencies suddenly downgraded Portugal to junk status. And at the same time, the rating agencies are slow to recognize countries that are on the upswing, like in Iceland. Iceland has bounced back from their episode of being victimized by financial terrorists, and yet the rating agencies are not applauding them and giving them the correct rating on the upside either. So are the rating agencies just part of a racket? Is it just part of the racket? And if so, do the Greek people understand that aspect of how they're being their wealth is being stolen?
Well, the thing with the rating agencies is that it's a sort of a nuanced subject, so it's something that I don't think many Greeks are really particularly aware of. But of course, we saw what role the rating agencies played in the United States leading up to 2008. They legitimized a lot of the garbage that was on the books of a lot of these banks that they rated as AAA, and they're sort of playing a reverse role in Europe right now, where we're seeing, of course, that peripheral carousel where you go from country to country. Every time a country is about to come under speculative attack, you see the rating agencies begin to ramp up the dialogue on that. And of course, now we're seeing more and more dialogue and more concern about Italian debt and the Italian fiscal situation with their large debt to GDP number and overall their very large nominal public debt. As far as collusion is concerned, there certainly seems to be. And certainly anyone who works on Wall Street will tell you that the best analysts on the street don't work at Moody's or S&P. They work at Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan. And at the very least, anyone who's working at one of those companies, at one of these rating agencies, is simply auditioning for a better and a higher paying job at Goldman Sachs and at JP Morgan. So I think that at the very least, these rating agencies play the job of PR firms, you could say, for these large banking institutions who have their own agenda, and I think the rating agencies are just there to do the bidding of these large banks.
All right, so Dimitri Kofinas, let's move on. I want to ask you a question pertaining to the inception of the euro and Greece's inclusion in the euro. At the time, the idea was this would end these countries from going to war with each other, that it would be a way to engineer financially a peace. And yet, with Germany effectively declaring financial war on Greece, and they are part of the racket, including the rating agencies, the hedge funds, and the Wall Street banks, can't Greece simply abrogate those contracts and say you violated the conditions of us joining because you have effectively declared war on us, and therefore you've violated the terms of the agreement? We don't recognize the agreement anymore. You violated the terms of the agreement.
Well, you're certainly right about the origins of the European Union. Originally, it was the European Coal and Steel Community, the Benelux countries, Germany, France, and Italy. And the purpose of that community, well, one of the purposes was to sort of eliminate that nationalism that was blamed for World War II, and also to bind together the significant and important industrial producing regions of Europe, so as to make war less desirable, let's say. Of course, war was less desirable prior to World War I. We also saw saw what happened there. As far as what sort of legal justification or legal right Greece may have to abrogate its debt responsibilities, claiming perhaps that the debt is onerous and should not be repaid, I don't know. But as far as I know, as far as I'm concerned, any sovereign country has the right to default on its debt if it feels that debt is counter to the public interest, counter to the sovereign interest, or detrimental to the health of the state. That's what Iceland did, that's what Argentina did, and that's what many countries have done in the past, including Greece. Greece has also defaulted on its debt in the past. It wasn't catastrophic. Every situation is different, but as far as I'm concerned, they have every right to do that. And in a situation like this, where no viable option or alternative is given to the country, they not only can, but should default on that debt.
Right. Well, I believe there was already a test case back, I believe in 1939. Greece defaulted on debt, claiming that the onerous debt was a hardship for the citizens, and it says very clearly in the Greek constitution that no debt should be encumbered onto the population that caused this type of hardship. So it's constitutionally imperative that the Greeks default on the debt, and Papandreou, by not defaulting, is breaking the Constitution, which, last I checked, was the definition of treason. Now, let's move on. Much of the Western media is portraying Greeks as lazy, that they retire at 53, that they've got it good down there. Your response?
Well, I mean, look, there's some truth to the fact that, I was at a wedding recently, for example, and the father of the groom told me that he had retired at 44 because he worked at a public company and he could do that. And that's to be expected. Anytime you have a large public sector which gives lucrative pensions and lucrative salaries, people are going to take that money. It's to be expected. But people in the private sector in Greece work an incredible number of hours. They're extremely hardworking. And if you want evidence for that, official evidence, you just have to look at OECD data, which shows that Greeks work the second largest number of hours behind South Korea per week, much more than Germans, much more than French and other members of the Eurozone. So the idea that Greeks are lazy is just an absurdity. And it's a malicious piece of propaganda that's often used in any situation where you've got an occupation, whether that's a financial occupation or a physical occupation. Certainly in countries that have large debt burdens. We saw that in Argentina, we saw it in Iceland, and in other countries where citizens are made to feel like they're somehow not worthy of sovereignty. Remember, we had Dominique Strauss-Kahn come into our parliament. So there is this sense of occupation, and there's this mythology that's purposefully perpetuated by the media that's meant to make Greeks feel like somehow they screwed up and now they deserve to lose everything. Certainly Greeks are to blame. Some people are more to blame than others. You can't blame everyone the same. But no amount of blame can justify the liquidation of a country's wealth and the liquidation of its people and its history, which is what we have going on in Greece right now. And that even speaks to a larger point, which is that, look, there's a lot of money in Greece. There's a lot of know-how, a lot of capability in Greece. Greeks are very capable, and if they were able to put a system together, if a system could be in place that rewarded entrepreneurship, that rewarded private capital and business and competition, then you could easily see Greeks excel economically. And the problem is that we don't have that, and the emphasis is not on reforming the regulatory structure in Greece. The emphasis, rather, is on liquidating national assets, on raising taxes, and on integrating Greece into this larger peripheral Europe and to this dream that Eurocrats have of a United States of Europe. It's not on what's best for the Greek people. And so I think this whole debate about whether Greeks are lazy or not, it's a red herring. It's just meant to I'd say demoralize the Greek people and make them more open to the suggestion of being turned into debt slaves for the Troika and for the EU and Eurocrats.
Right. Well, the occupying forces always try to scapegoat the people that they're occupying and portray them in less than flattering terms as a way to try to justify their occupation. And I agree with you that this vilification of the public workers is quite remarkable, actually, because the barriers to entry, for example, to become a hedge fund manager are non-existent. Anyone could become a hedge fund manager. So if all public workers simply became hedge fund managers, then all the profits that are gleaned by the few hedge fund managers there are, by the rent-seeking and market manipulation that they engage in, would disappear. So it's because these people would like to have some kind of purpose with their life that they choose to do something purposeful. And yet then they get painted as lazy because they're not engaged in racketeering. So anyone who's not part of the racket is quote unquote lazy. Well, let's talk about these asset sales. 50 billion euros has been targeted in assets to be sold off by the Greek government at the behest of the Troika and the foreign occupying forces. These are income-producing assets that were built by the tax revenue of the Greek people. They're going to let these slip away, Dimitri Kofinas.
I mean, that's a really good question because, as I said before, one of the major sticking points for the austerity packages is not as much the taxes, though people are obviously against those. It's the privatizations, because there are a lot of public sector unions that have a lot to lose, have the most to lose from privatization measures. In fact, many Greeks in the country have for a long time wanted to cut the public sector. So it isn't necessarily the privatization that people have a problem with. It's the privatization of these monopoly companies without any guarantees that the monopoly is going to be broken up, that there's going to be any kind of free market competition in its place, where Greeks are going to be able to challenge these existing monopoly structures that are now owned by foreign companies, foreign multinationals. We saw this in Bolivia with the privatization of water. Just because you privatize a company doesn't necessarily mean that you do anything to change the domestic economic structure or the domestic economic or political conditions. And in fact, that's what we're seeing in Greece. We're not seeing any emphasis on changing the regulation. There's a lot of talk, but no action. The action is on the liquidation, on the sale, and on tax increases. But specifically to your point about whether they'll be able to pass these measures, I think that the only hope the Greek people really have, and I said this before, will come from what's happening in Constitution Square and in other areas of Athens where people are coalescing together, and there's this kind of network effect, this network externality of knowledge, of capability, of character, where patriots and like-minded people coalesce together to try and form a political alternative. Because if this government falls and another one is put in place and that government falls too, and rioting continues, and there is no political alternative, then eventually you're going to have a sale of all these assets come to pass, and then Greece will eventually have to default on its debt, and at that point there'll be nothing left, no national wealth, no national assets, and you'll have a chaotic return to the drachma, some sort of bank collapse. And as our VP had recently come out and said, really there's a real threat that you might have a return to some sort of hyper-security police state.
You mentioned Constitution Square there. And in the Constitution Square, they've got the People's Assembly, which, of course, is very active in featuring speakers and reviewing some of the issues of the day. The People's Assembly in Constitution Square has recently issued a warning to potential investors not to buy into the privatization schemes because of undisclosed risk. This is an approach we've seen elsewhere with other groups, and it has worked effectively for other groups. Is this going to work for the anti-privatization forces in Athens, and will we see more of it, Dimitri?
Well, ironically, I think that the biggest benefit that a lot of these anti-privatization groups have, or people that are against these measures, the way they're being carried out, have going in their favor is the actual effects of these privatizations and the way that they're being implemented, because they're causing an economic collapse, they're causing political and economic instability, and who really wants to invest in a country when the economic and political situation is so unstable and the outlook is so unstable. So I think that ironically, the very actions of the creditors, the very actions of those trying to liquidate assets are making it inhospitable, making the country inhospitable for the very investments that they would like to carry out.
We only have about a minute left, so I want to move on. When I was in Athens recently, we had a chance to chat, and I want you to speak about how we define this conflict a little bit, because the media tends to talk about the communists in Greece versus the quote-unquote capitalists in Greece, and they completely leave out the entrepreneurs in Greece. It seems to me, having been there, that this is a conflict between the entrepreneurs and what I call the rigged market capitalists, and this is not really about communism at all.
Well, that's actually a very good point, actually. And I think that, look, there's a strong communist element in Greece in terms of politically and economically the ideology, but it's a defunct one. It's not one that's going to provide any kind of real solutions today. So as you said, the real battle is between the entrepreneurs, between the people who want to work, who can work, who are capable, and who are creative and industrious, and then those people who are looking to perpetuate this rent-seeking approach from the outside. And that goes back to my point about Constitution Square and the people that are gathering there, and the network effect. Because if you're going to have any kind of real economic growth and in the future in that country, the networks of people working together and the opportunities are going to come from the people in that square and other like-minded people who are industrious and who want to change. And I think that's the key takeaway with respect to your point.
Yeah, I don't understand the double standard here, because in the United States, for example, after the dot-com crash of 2000, the government didn't move in and seize Silicon Valley and turn it into a theme park or a lumber mill or something. They were allowed to fail. And then now, 10 years later, we have a new generation of web entrepreneurs and new companies going public. This is called entrepreneurialism and free market capitalism. Greece should be allowed to fail, quote unquote, but they should not lose their sovereignty. That seems to be a ridiculous penalty to appease bankers who are in the business of taking risks. That's their business. They can't simply take the profits when they have profits and then socialize or dump the risks elsewhere when they have a loss. Anyway, would you agree with that, Dimitri?
Absolutely. And just to end on that point, what we're seeing here is a complete destruction of the nation state. What we're seeing here is a complete reversal of everything that happens to the Treaty of Westphalia, and a desire to move this world into one run by multinational corporations and banks for their monopoly benefit. And all that does is it squeezes out the entrepreneur, it squeezes out the really creative individual that makes growth possible. And there are a lot of entrepreneurs in Greece. Culturally, they're very entrepreneurial people, and if any nation could benefit from an economic structure that rewarded competition and rewarded entrepreneurship, it would be the Greek nation.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of On the Edge. Dimitri Kofinas, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you. Loved it.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of On the Edge with me, Max Kaiser. I want to thank my guest, Dimitri Kofinas. If you want to send me an email, please do so at ontheedge@presstv.com. Until next time, this is Max Kaiser saying bye, y'all.